The wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Her heart raced with excitement as she walked down the aisle, ready to begin a new chapter with the man she had chosen to spend her future with. The venue was filled with flowers, music, and smiling faces, all reflecting the joy of the occasion. But in that instant, when she turned her gaze toward her son, everything changed. The sharp sound of a slap echoed through the hall. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she saw the unthinkable. Her new husband, a man she had trusted, had slapped her son right in the middle of the ceremony. The shock left her frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. It didn't make sense. Why? You're such a nuisance. The words cut through the air, loud enough for everyone to hear. The entire room fell silent, the joy turning to awkward confusion. The mother stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend what had just happened. She had hoped for a fresh start, for this marriage to bring a sense of unity, but what she witnessed shattered that dream in an instant. Her son stood there, frozen in place, staring back at the man she had just married. His face was a mixture of shock and pain, his body stiff with the sting of the slap. His eyes locked with hers, pleading for her to understand, for her to step in and make it right. But she couldn't move. She couldn't think. Her mind raced. She had seen her son struggle with the changes in their family, but she never imagined it would come to this, her own husband treating her child like this in front of everyone. The wedding that was meant to celebrate love and new beginnings now felt like a battlefield, one where the most important relationship of all, mother and son, was being torn apart before her eyes. The guests, unsure of what to do, glanced at one another, their faces filled with confusion. No one knew how to react. The tension in the air was thick, heavy, suffocating. She wanted to say something, to stand up for her son, but the words wouldn't come. She felt paralyzed, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess of emotions. She had married this man just hours ago, believing in the promises he made to love her and her son. But now? Now, the reality was impossible to ignore. He had just struck her child, someone she had spent years raising and protecting. Her heart shattered as the silence grew unbearable. The pain in her son's eyes was more than she could bear, and the anger in her new husband's voice made her question everything. What was happening to the family she was trying so desperately to build? And how had it all gone so horribly wrong? In the quiet aftermath of the slap, she finally took a step forward, her legs shaky as though every movement was an effort. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to fix this. But there was no going back now. The trust she thought she had was crumbling, the foundation of her new life slipping away with every passing second. Her wedding day, the day she had imagined for so long, was now tainted with the shock of that slap and the words that would haunt her forever. "You're such a nuisance." They echoed in her mind, growing louder with each passing moment. What had led to this moment? How could it be fixed? Would she have to choose between her husband and her son? As she stood there, heart racing, her mind desperately trying to make sense of what had just happened, one thing became clear: this was just the beginning. The excitement in the air was palpable as the wedding preparations reached their peak. Everything had been carefully planned, from the beautiful floral arrangements to the perfect dress she had dreamed about for years. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, a new beginning, a fresh start for her and her son. Her heart swelled with hope as she imagined the future she and her new husband would build together. It felt like a fairy tale, one she had longed for, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that this was going to be the turning point in their lives. She had met him a little over a year ago. A man who seemed to have everything: a successful career, a charming personality, and the ability to make her feel like the center of his world. He treated her with care and respect, his gentle manner soothing the anxieties that had plagued her since her divorce. She thought he would be the answer to the loneliness she had felt for so long, a companion who would make her whole again. She believed he could be the man to help her raise her son, who had already faced more challenges than most children ever should. Her son, Eli, was everything to her. He had been through so much, having to adjust to the separation of his parents and the emotional turmoil that came with it. She did her best to shield him from the pain, but there were moments when his hurt was too deep to ignore. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't stop the confusion in his eyes when he first met her fiancé, Jason. It wasn't that he disliked him, but there was a wariness in Eli's gaze, a skepticism that she couldn't fully explain. Jason had been kind to him at first, always showing interest in his hobbies and trying to bond over shared activities. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that there was a deeper tension she was too afraid to confront. As the wedding day arrived, Eli seemed distant, not quite himself. He had spent the morning locked in his room, and when she knocked on his door, his eyes were red-rimmed, as though he had been fighting back tears. She had tried to reassure him, telling him how wonderful everything would be once they were a family. But she saw the uncertainty in his eyes, and it broke her heart. She told herself that it was just pre-wedding nerves, that things would settle once the ceremony was over. She had no idea how wrong she was. The ceremony was beautiful. She had walked down the aisle with her heart full of joy, eager to start a new chapter of her life. Jason stood at the altar, looking every bit the handsome groom she had imagined, his smile radiant as he waited for her. In that moment, she truly believed that everything was going to be perfect. The vows they exchanged were heartfelt, their promises sincere. But in the back of her mind, there was a lingering thought: would it work? Would Eli accept him as his new father? Could Jason ever truly understand the bond she shared with her son? Eli had been sitting in the front row, looking calm on the surface, but she knew him well enough to see that he was struggling. As the ceremony continued, she caught sight of his fidgeting hands, his gaze darting nervously toward the back of the room, as if searching for an escape. She tried to send him a reassuring smile, but it did little to ease his discomfort. When the vows were exchanged and the crowd erupted into applause, it was then that the first sign of trouble appeared. As they turned to walk down the aisle together, ready to begin their life as a married couple, she noticed Eli's eyes, wide and unblinking, staring at her. His expression was unreadable, as though something inside him had snapped. She tried to catch his gaze, but he quickly turned his head away, staring straight ahead. His face, once filled with hope for a new family, was now clouded with uncertainty and a deepening sadness. She felt a knot twist in her stomach. It was as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. She was supposed to be happy, to celebrate the start of this new chapter, but her heart ached for her son. She tried to shake off the unease, telling herself that things would get better once they were home, once they had time to adjust to the new reality of their lives. But as the wedding reception began, it was clear that things were far from settled. Jason tried to be the perfect new husband, constantly by her side, offering her compliments and gestures of affection. But every time he reached out to Eli, the young boy recoiled slightly, a subtle gesture that no one seemed to notice. Eli was doing his best to hold it together, but the walls he had built up around himself were becoming stronger with each passing moment. The evening wore on, and the celebration continued, but the unease never left her heart. She looked around at the people laughing and dancing, but all she could think about was the look on her son's face. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. As the night wore on, she made her way to Eli, sitting quietly by the window, gazing out into the darkness. She sat beside him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. He flinched at the touch but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I just don't feel right about this." Her heart broke as she pulled him into a tight embrace. She had no answers for him, no way to make him feel better. All she could do was hold him and hope that tomorrow would bring a clearer path for them both. Little did she know, the events that would follow would shatter everything she thought she knew about the future she was building. Eli had always been a sensitive boy, even as a young child. He felt everything deeply: joy, sorrow, frustration. After the divorce, he became even more withdrawn. He wasn't angry, but it was clear that something inside him had changed. His mother had tried to shield him from the heartache, to put on a brave face and assure him that everything would be okay, but Eli wasn't so sure. He loved his mom more than anything, but his heart longed for the familiar comfort of the life he had once known, before it all fell apart. For the first time in years, his mother had found happiness again. Jason had appeared out of nowhere, with his warm smile and gentle words. He made her laugh again, a sound that had been missing for far too long. Eli saw the joy in her eyes whenever Jason was around, and he wanted to believe it too. But there was something about Jason that made him uneasy. It wasn't just the man's size or appearance, it was something deeper, something Eli couldn't quite explain. At first, Jason tried hard to win Eli over. He would take him to baseball games, try to bond with him over video games, and often bought him little gifts, things he thought a boy like Eli would appreciate. But nothing seemed to work. Eli would smile politely, but his eyes always seemed distant, as if he were looking for something that Jason could never give him. It wasn't that Eli didn't like him, it was just that Jason wasn't his father. No matter how much he tried, Eli's heart wasn't ready to accept a man who wasn't the one who had always been there for him. The more time passed, the more the tension grew. Jason, frustrated by Eli's cool distance, started to withdraw his efforts. He would make jokes that seemed harmless but were laced with irritation. "You know, Eli, you could be a little more grateful. I'm not doing this for me," Jason would say, his voice carrying an edge Eli couldn't ignore. "Your mom's a good woman, and I'm just trying to help you, kid." But Eli didn't feel helped. He felt pushed aside, like he was nothing more than an obstacle in Jason's way. Eli wasn't the type to lash out, at least not with words. He kept everything bottled up inside, but it was beginning to eat away at him. He had always been a good son, obeying his mother's wishes, doing his best in school, and trying to make friends. But now, with Jason in the picture, he felt like he was losing himself. Jason was the new man of the house, but Eli felt as though he had been forgotten. All those times when his mom used to sit with him, helping him with his homework, talking about his day, now it was Jason who got her attention. Jason was the one she smiled at across the room, the one she shared stories with. She seemed so happy with him, but Eli was left feeling invisible. On the surface, everything seemed fine. Eli was doing his best to hold it together for his mom, pretending like everything was okay. He didn't want to ruin her happiness, but inside, it was all becoming too much. The little cracks that had begun forming in their relationship only deepened with time. Eli longed for her to see him, to look past the mask he wore and realize just how much he was hurting. One evening, the tension reached a breaking point. Eli had been in his room for hours, working on a school project that he had no interest in. His mother knocked on his door, a gentle smile on her face, but he could see the worry in her eyes. "Eli, honey, can we talk?" she asked softly. He didn't respond right away, pretending to focus on his project, though he knew she could see through the facade. She walked into the room and sat down beside him. "I've noticed you've been a little distant lately," she said, her voice full of concern. "Is there something going on? Something I should know about?" Eli stared down at his desk, his fingers absently tapping the wood. The truth was, there was so much he wanted to say. He wanted to scream at her, to tell her how much he missed the way things used to be. But instead, he kept it in. "I'm fine, Mom." "Really?" he lied, forcing a small smile. She wasn't convinced. "You don't have to hide anything from me, you know. I'm here for you, no matter what." She reached for his hand, but Eli pulled it away gently. "I just don't think he gets it, Mom," Eli muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't understand me, and I don't think he ever will." His mother's face softened with understanding, though it was clear she was torn. She wanted to believe that Jason would eventually become a part of their family, that everything would fall into place. But she couldn't deny that something wasn't right. She had seen the coldness in Jason's demeanor at times, the way his patience wore thin when Eli didn't warm up to him as quickly as he'd hoped. But she wasn't sure what to do. She loved Jason, and she wanted him to be part of their lives. Could she force Eli to accept him? Should she? "I'm trying, Mom," Eli continued, his voice breaking. "But I just don't know how to feel. He's not my dad. He never will be." Her heart shattered as she heard the words. She had always known that this would be a tough adjustment for Eli, but she hadn't realized just how deeply it was affecting him. In her mind, she had hoped that the time would heal everything. But now, it was clear that the fracture between them was only growing wider, and she didn't know how to fix it. As Eli wiped away a tear, his mother pulled him into a tight hug, feeling the weight of his pain. She wished she could make it all better, but she knew the truth: nothing would ever be the same again. The road ahead was uncertain, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't undo the hurt that had already taken root. The love she had for Jason and her son seemed to be at odds now, and she didn't know how to make both sides happy. All she could do was pray that somehow, they would find a way to heal, before it was too late. The days following the wedding passed in a blur of awkward silences and strained conversations. Every time the new family tried to come together, there was a sense of unease that hung in the air like a thick fog. The honeymoon phase of their marriage, so full of hope and excitement, had evaporated. Instead, Jason seemed more frustrated, and Eli more withdrawn. And all the while, she stood in the middle, unsure how to bridge the ever-widening gap between the two most important people in her life. It was a Saturday morning when the first signs of real trouble appeared. She had planned a family outing, thinking a simple trip to the park would bring some fresh air and a chance to ease the tension. She thought the change of scenery might help. Maybe if they spent time together outside the house, it would open up a chance for them to bond. But from the moment they set foot outside the door, she could feel the distance between them growing even more. Jason was on edge, snapping at every small thing. When Eli asked him if they could stop for a snack, Jason's response was curt. "Why can't you just wait? It's not that hard." Eli flinched, his usual reaction to Jason's harsh tone. She caught the look of hurt that flashed across her son's face, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago not to intervene in those moments, knowing it would only make things worse. But as they walked, her heart grew heavier with each step. How had it come to this? The trip to the park was no better. They walked in silence, Eli lingering behind, as he often did these days, while Jason walked ahead, his jaw clenched. Her mind raced as she watched the scene unfold, a sinking feeling in her stomach. Was this really the life she wanted for them? Could she fix this? Was it too late? It was then that the breaking point came. They had found a secluded spot in the park, a quiet area under a large oak tree where they could sit and try to talk. But just as she was about to ask Jason how his day was going, Eli spoke up, his voice low but tinged with frustration. "I don't want to be here." His words were blunt, and there was a coldness to them that she hadn't expected. "I don't want to pretend everything is fine. It's not." Jason turned to face him, his patience finally wearing thin. "You know what? You've been acting like a brat ever since we got here. I'm trying to do things for you, to give you a family, and all you do is complain." Eli's eyes widened, as if the words stung deeper than he could have imagined. "You don't get it, Jason," he said, his voice breaking. "You're not my dad. You never will be." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Jason's face hardened, and the tension in his body was palpable. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe I don't want to be your dad," he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "Maybe I don't want to be around someone who can't appreciate what I'm trying to do." The mother's heart skipped a beat, the gravity of the situation sinking in. She had been here before, caught between two people she loved, each pulling her in a different direction. But this time, it felt different. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was a full-blown clash of worlds, and it was happening right before her eyes. "Jason, stop," she pleaded, her voice trembling. She reached out, her hand on his arm, trying to pull him back, but he shrugged her off. He wasn't done yet. "Why are you always taking his side?" Jason snapped, his voice rising with anger. "What about me? What about my feelings? I've been nothing but patient with him, and all I get is this." He pointed angrily at Eli, who stood frozen, his face pale and his eyes wide with disbelief. "I'm sick of it. You think I'm just supposed to accept him like he's some perfect little angel, when he doesn't even try to make this work?" Eli opened his mouth to say something, but she was faster. "That's enough." Her voice cracked, but the words were firm. "This stops now, both of you." She stood between them, her arms raised to separate them as if she could somehow push the tension away. "I won't let this destroy what's left of my family." The silence that followed was deafening. The wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree, but for a moment, everything else stood still. Jason was fuming, his fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't speak. Eli, too, said nothing. His face was full of hurt and confusion, as if he had no idea how things had spiraled so far out of control. She turned to Eli, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Eli, I know this is hard. But Jason is trying. He really is. Can't you at least try to see that?" Eli's lips trembled as he looked at her, and for a moment, she saw the boy he used to be, the one who trusted her, the one who wanted to believe in the family they could have. But that boy seemed so far away now. "Mom," he whispered, barely audible, "I don't want to be forced to like him." Her heart shattered as she knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "I'm not trying to force you to like him, sweetheart. I'm just asking you to give him a chance. I'm asking you to try." But even as she said the words, she knew that something fundamental had changed. Eli wasn't just rejecting Jason, he was rejecting the whole new life she had worked so hard to build. She could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air, and a knot formed in her stomach. As she stood there, looking between the two men in her life, she realized that the family she had hoped for was slipping further out of reach. Was it too late to repair the damage? Could she salvage this marriage, or was it already broken beyond repair? The tension had boiled over, and there was no going back. The drive home from the park was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts, weighed down by the events of the day. The car felt too small for the three of them, as if the space between them had grown too large to be contained within four doors. She sat in the front seat, trying to focus on the road, but all she could think about was the explosion that had just happened. The words Jason had thrown at Eli, the way her son's face had crumpled under the weight of it all, everything played over and over in her mind. She wanted to scream, to demand that everything go back to the way it was, but she knew better. She knew that things had changed, and no amount of wishing could undo it. Eli sat quietly in the back seat, his eyes staring out the window, his body rigid with the weight of emotions he didn't know how to process. He hadn't said a word since they left the park, and it was obvious that he was still trying to make sense of what had just happened. The slap of Jason's words had left a mark, deeper than anything physical. She could see it in his eyes, in the way his shoulders slumped with defeat. Jason, on the other hand, seemed consumed with his own anger. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as if holding onto it was the only thing keeping him from losing control. He was still fuming, his breath coming in quick bursts, his mind clearly still racing with frustration. She didn't know what to do. She had spent the entire ride hoping that Jason would calm down, that somehow, they could all make it through this night without further destruction. But the words Jason had said in the park were still echoing in her mind. The way he had lashed out at Eli, the way his frustration had boiled over and spilled out in front of everyone. It wasn't just about Eli anymore. It was about something much bigger, a deep-seated resentment that had been building for weeks, months even, between the two of them. Finally, the silence was broken when they arrived home. Eli immediately rushed up to his room, not bothering to even look at her, let alone say goodbye. She didn't blame him. She couldn't. She had seen the hurt in his eyes too many times to ignore it. She didn't know how to fix it, how to make it better. The truth was, she felt helpless. Jason stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind him. He didn't even acknowledge her presence as he walked toward the house. He was too angry, too proud. And she was too exhausted to try and calm him down again. When they entered the house, she stood in the kitchen, unsure of what to do next. Jason paced back and forth, muttering under his breath. "I'm trying, okay? I'm trying, but I don't know what you want from me anymore. I can't do this. I can't keep pretending like this is working when he refuses to even give me a chance. You don't understand how hard it is to walk into a house every day and feel like you're being rejected." She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. She wanted to tell him that she understood, that she too felt the strain of it all. But how could she explain something that neither of them wanted to face? How could she admit that, for the first time, she was beginning to wonder if she had made the right choice by marrying him? Could she really be with a man who treated her son this way? Could she live with the knowledge that the very person she had chosen to build her future with was so willing to turn his back on her child? "I don't know what you expect from me," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I've tried everything to make this work. I wanted to believe that we could be a family. But every time I try, it feels like we just take 2 steps back." Jason stopped pacing, his face a mask of frustration. "What do you want me to do? I've been patient with him, but he doesn't make it easy. He doesn't want this. He doesn't want me. And I can't just pretend that everything is okay when it's not. I'm trying to give him a chance, but he makes it impossible." Her heart ached as she looked at him, seeing the anger and hurt in his eyes, but also the walls he had built around himself. He was so caught up in his own frustrations that he couldn't see what was really happening. He was too focused on what Eli wasn't doing to realize what he himself was doing wrong. "I know," she said, her voice soft. "But it's not just about trying. It's about understanding. Eli has been through so much. He's been through a divorce, and now you're asking him to accept you as a father figure. It's not that simple. He's still trying to figure out who he is, and where he fits in all of this. And the last thing he needs right now is someone else pushing him away." Jason ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated and defeated. "I didn't ask for this either, you know. I didn't sign up to be some perfect stepdad. But I'm trying, I swear." She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in her chest. "I know you're trying, Jason. But sometimes, trying isn't enough. Sometimes, it takes more than just patience and good intentions. It takes real understanding. And right now, I don't think either of us is really listening to what Eli needs." Jason's face softened, and for a brief moment, she thought he might finally understand. But then he looked away, his jaw tightening. "What do you want me to do?" he repeated, his voice quieter now, tinged with hopelessness. "I want you to listen," she whispered, feeling the tears well up in her eyes. "I want you to understand that this is more than just a relationship between you and me. This is about a family, Jason. And I can't choose between the two of you. I won't." The silence that followed was deafening. Neither of them spoke. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for one of them to finally make the first move. But in that moment, she realized that no matter what choice she made, the damage had already been done. Their world had shifted, and there was no turning back. The questions that plagued her mind, should she choose her husband or her son, remained unanswered, as the realization set in. The love between them was real, but it was fragile. And the cracks in their relationship were starting to show. The days that followed felt like they were wrapped in a heavy fog, thick with unresolved emotions and a sense of dread. Every step she took around the house seemed like an effort, as if the weight of her decisions was pressing down on her shoulders with increasing intensity. Eli, retreating further into himself, spent most of his time locked away in his room, his presence in the house as distant as the unspoken words between them. Jason, too, was distant, though his frustration simmered beneath the surface. He no longer tried to make things work. Instead, he retreated into his work, spending long hours out of the house, as though his absence could somehow make everything better. She could feel it, the tension between them all, like a living thing, crawling through every room, filling the air with a quiet but relentless pressure. She wanted to fix it, wanted to reach out and find some way to bring her family back together, but every time she tried, it felt like she was pulling at threads that only unraveled further. Eli's reaction was the hardest to bear. She could see him withdrawing from her, the boy who once relied on her for comfort now turning inward, hiding his pain. She had tried to talk to him, tried to bridge the gap that had grown so wide between them, but he would give her short answers, avoiding her eyes. He would sit with her at dinner, but the silence between them was deafening. There was no more laughter, no more sharing of small moments. All she wanted was for him to open up, to tell her what he was feeling, but each attempt seemed to push him further away. One night, after dinner, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, wondering if she should reach out to someone for advice, someone who could help her navigate the mess she had made. But who could she turn to? Her friends? They had seen her happy, had celebrated her wedding with her. What could she tell them now? That her marriage was falling apart, that her son was slipping through her fingers? How could she admit that she was failing at both? She set the phone down and stared at the window, watching the rain fall outside, the sound of the droplets hitting the glass a small comfort. Her mind wandered to the day they had arrived home after the disastrous trip to the park. Jason had been distant since then, barely speaking, and when he did, it was as though each word was carefully measured, each sentence a potential trigger for another argument. She didn't know how much longer they could go on like this. After a long day of silence between them, she finally reached her breaking point. She couldn't bear to see her son so hurt, so lost. And she couldn't stand the thought of losing Jason, the man she had married, the man she had hoped would become the partner she could share everything with. The choices she had to make felt impossible, but she knew she couldn't keep avoiding them. She had to talk to Jason, to figure out what they both wanted, what they needed. And she needed to talk to Eli, to find out how he was really feeling, to understand what was in his heart. That night, she sat in front of the fireplace, waiting for Jason to return from his latest work trip, which had become his favorite way of escaping their problems. When he finally came home, she didn't waste any time. She knew that this conversation was long overdue. "Jason," she began, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "We need to talk." He looked at her, his face weary, his tired eyes filled with a mix of frustration and reluctance. He opened his mouth, probably to say something about how he didn't have time for this, but she held up her hand, stopping him. "No, Jason. Not tonight. We need to fix this. We can't go on pretending that everything is fine when it isn't." He sighed and sat down across from her, his gaze never meeting hers. "I don't know what you want from me, okay? I'm tired. I'm trying, but it feels like nothing's changing. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." Her heart ached hearing his words, but she couldn't back down now. "I'm not asking for perfection, Jason. I just want us to listen to each other, to stop pretending we don't see what's happening. I'm not asking you to be a perfect stepfather, but I need you to understand that Eli is struggling. He's not rejecting you on purpose. He's rejecting what he doesn't understand, what he feels he's losing." Jason's eyes softened for a moment, but then the walls came back up. I don't know what to do. He won't talk to me. He won't even try. She reached across the table, placing a hand gently on his. Because you haven't been listening, Jason. You've been focused on what he isn't doing instead of understanding what he's going through. He's scared. He's hurting. And he doesn't know how to deal with it. But I know him better than anyone. I know what he needs. Jason's jaw tightened, and he looked away. I don't know if I can do this, he muttered. I don't know if I can do this either, she whispered, her voice breaking. But I'm willing to try, Jason. For him. For us. But I can't do it alone. I need you to help me. We need to talk to him together. We need to show him that we're in this together, that we're a family, even if it takes time. The room fell silent for a long moment. Jason stared at the table, clearly torn. She could see the internal battle raging inside him. It wasn't easy for him, but it wasn't easy for her either. This was a new family they were trying to build, and it wasn't going to be perfect. But she knew one thing: if they didn't find a way to communicate, to understand each other, they would lose everything. I'm willing to try, Jason said quietly, finally meeting her gaze. For you, for him, I'll try. Her heart swelled with relief, but she knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and filled with more obstacles, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. They were willing to fight for their family, and that was all she needed to move forward. Later that evening, she went to Eli's room, knocking softly before opening the door. He sat on his bed, his eyes red from crying. She sat beside him, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. I know it's been hard, she said softly. But I need you to know that I'm here for you. And Jason is, too. He's trying, Eli. I know it doesn't feel like it, but we're both trying. Eli looked at her, tears still glistening in his eyes. I don't want things to change, Mom. I don't want to lose you. She pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly. You won't lose me, sweetheart. No matter what happens, you'll never lose me. We'll figure this out together. The weight of the conversation was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, she believed they might just be able to find a way through the pain. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was a start. A small glimmer of hope in a dark time. The days that followed were filled with small steps forward, each one fragile but necessary. It wasn't easy. There were moments when frustration threatened to boil over, when words were said in anger, and old wounds reopened. But with each passing day, there was something new, something hopeful. It wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't without setbacks, but they were learning, slowly, how to rebuild. Jason and Eli still didn't see eye to eye most of the time, but there were moments of quiet understanding. Jason had begun to make more of an effort, small things, like listening when Eli spoke and trying to connect on his terms. Eli, too, was making his own efforts. He wasn't ready to call Jason Dad, but he was beginning to soften, to trust a little more with each passing day. And while there were still moments of tension, the small victories, those brief, fragile moments when they felt like a family again, were enough to keep them moving forward. It was a rainy afternoon when things finally shifted. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she heard the sound of laughter coming from the living room. Surprised, she stepped into the room to find Jason and Eli sitting on the couch, engrossed in an old game they had both clearly forgotten about. They were laughing over something silly, a shared joke that no one else would have understood, and in that moment, she saw it, they saw it, the beginning of a connection. Eli's eyes were no longer filled with the coldness he had once shown Jason. Instead, there was something like acceptance in them. Not complete, not perfect, but real. And Jason looked different. His face was lighter, less burdened, as if a weight had been lifted. He caught her gaze and smiled, a smile that wasn't just for her, but for the two of them, for this fragile new bond they were slowly building. "Hey, Mom, come watch this," Eli said, his voice light, as though inviting her into their world for the first time in months. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. It had been so long since the three of them had shared a simple, joyful moment. It felt like a small miracle, and yet it was so much more than that. It was a sign that things could be better, that they weren't doomed. She smiled, her heart swelling with hope, and took a seat next to them. For the rest of the evening, they shared stories, laughed, and even played a game together, something so simple but so profound. As she watched Eli and Jason laugh together, her heart softened, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a peace that had seemed impossible just days before. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. It was a start. Later that night, after Eli had gone to bed, Jason pulled her aside. "I know things haven't been easy," he said, his voice quiet, "but I think we're getting there. It's slow, but I think we're figuring this out." She nodded, feeling the weight of the words settle deep in her heart. "We are," she said softly. "We really are." As they stood there together, she realized something that had eluded her for so long: family wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about getting it all right the first time. It was about trying, about showing up even when things were hard, even when it felt impossible. Family was about fighting through the rough patches, about making space for each other's struggles, and growing together, no matter how long it took. Her eyes misted as she looked at Jason, her heart full of a quiet, powerful understanding. They had both been through so much, each carrying their own burdens, their own pain. But they had found a way to take the next step together. And as she stood there, holding his hand, she realized that the lesson of the past few weeks wasn't just about family or love, it was about resilience. About choosing to keep moving forward, no matter how tough the road ahead seemed. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, she knew with certainty that they would get through this. Together.